Hey people, it's the early hours of the morning, 1st of April, so I'm gonna try not to raise my voice too high, for obvious reasons. Just want to say a few words about the parole decision on Charles Bronson, i.e. Charles Salvador, whatever he called himself. I briefly referenced this in my video about Rishi Sunak's crime proposals. One thing I'll just say about that in passing, aside from what I already said, is that one of the contentions about these proposals is that adding new legislation doesn't necessarily improve matters. I think some of it's welcome, certainly giving victims more of a say, but um, I think there needs to be a focus on solidifying current laws and enforcing current laws. That's a big issue. I think police forces need to go about enforcing these things instead of wasting time over non-crime hate incidents, so-called, policing wrong pronoun usage and so on. So enforcing current legislation is an important thing. Anyway, yeah, so this decision has caused a lot of debate online on LBC and other sources. And I have to say, I've mixed feelings about it. On one hand, I think the parole board made the right decision, and I'll come to that. But I'm kind of disturbed by the number of people that are going out of their way to defend Bronson. Um, I think it's quite telling about our society. Um, so, bit of background here. If you don't know what I'm referring to, Charles Bronson, Charles Salvador, he's changed his name legally, apparently to be named after the famous surrealist artist Salvador Dali, which really says a lot. But basically he's an infamous character. He's Britain's longest serving prisoner, or one of the longest. He spent many years in solitary confinement, which, is not something I take lightly. I think it is, there's questions around human rights issues with that one. The point is, that's what he's known for. He's a violent career criminal. Now, there's so many excuses made for this guy, and one of them is, oh, but it's the system that made him violent. So they're implying that he was in prison for a non-violent offence. This was a violent man to begin with. Now you can get into all the background about why he was violent, why are criminals the way they are, circumstances, all the rest of it. But that's the reality, right? That's the fact. Um, he was in prison initially for armed robbery, okay? Not for some sort of like not paying his taxes or shoplifting or something like that. He was in prison for armed robbery, serious offense. It's a violent offense. Think of the fear it would have put into the bank clerks um, that he held up, you know. So it's not a small thing. That's an important point to start off with because people act like the system made him violent. No, he was a violent man to start off with. Maybe the system didn't help, but this idea that, oh, he was some sort of peaceful offender and, the system made him violent is utterly preposterous. Um, the parole board has denied his parole because of his history of violence on the inside. That's the reasoning. And also, a big thing they take into account is whether the person shows real remorse for their actions. From what I've seen from his statements, and I haven't looked at this, in absolute comprehensive detail, but I haven't seen any evidence that he's showing any real remorse for what he's done. He hasn't said, I recognize that I have a violent past. And one big thing with this guy, and it's something I've noticed over the years in previous parole hearings, is he sort of hides behind this eccentric personality. And maybe some of that is genuinely in his personality, but it's like, oh, I'm just an artist and look how eccentric I am. And he sort of plays this buffoonery act. Behind that is a violent man with a pretty violent past. I mean, the amount of violence he's done inside probably is a lot more than even what he's done outside. And that's significant because it shows that he is not a reformed character. There are occasionally prisoners who go through the system, they do their time, they come out and they don't reoffend. Of course, reducing recidivism should be a major part of rehabilitation. But the issue I have with Charles Bronson, Salvador, is that people are ignoring the fact that this is the track record. It's not like he went to prison 50 years ago or whatever it was. I think it was the 70s, early 70s, he was first imprisoned. And, he's done many years and that's went without problems and they're just unfairly picking on him. The parole board would have looked at his history inside. Okay. What about the innocent people he held hostage? Again, his apologists are excusing that like it's some sort of small thing. No doubt they would have had post-traumatic stress for a long time afterwards, having a knife held to the throat. This is not someone we should be sympathizing with. And I get that he's an old man now, he's in his 70s. Probably he's not a major risk to the public. I accept that. I accept that he's probably not a major risk to the public. What I find really hard to stomach is this bleating, this, cacophony of tears over this man. Like he's someone we should feel sorry for. Um, One of the things is, oh, but what about, child molesters and drug dealers and people list off other terrible criminals? Well, my response to that is, yeah, they should also be behind bars. It's not a case of, because Bronson's been denied parole, then they should get parole. I think actually, more often than not, I'm critical of the parole board, especially when you hear of terrorists coming out. Early, in fact, the fishmonger tall attacker had been on parole, I understand, and there was understandable anger over that incident. So I'm certainly not saying they always get it right. And I think when a serious crime is, committed, I think they need to be answerable to the public. I think heads need to roll metaphorically, resignations need to follow in the worst cases. Certainly, there are situations where people should not be granted parole. Public safety is a major, major deciding factor, but I think sometimes even if the person is deemed to be less of a threat than they were, if the crime is so heinous, I'm not sure that they should be released. In the case of Thompson, probably the right approach. I certainly wouldn't advocate putting him in solitary confinement, but I'd suggest maybe a lower category prison or something. But the idea he should walk free when he's shown no real remorse, when he has a history of violence. There's another issue with all of this, which is that he's institutionalized. I mean, I'm woe to compare him to the character in Shawshank Redemption, the old man who, it's a sad scene where he goes out, if you've seen the film, and he basically hangs himself because he can't adapt to the outside world, but yeah, I mean, could Bronson really adapt in his 70s when he spent most of his life behind bars? So arguably, it wouldn't even be in his favour to let him out. I do think there's perhaps overuse of solitary confinement. I'm not overly comfortable with that. But that's just this perverse idea that he's some sort of folk hero, and I'm hearing people talk like that. Like really, I'm not talking about people who say, well, he's not a threat now, and he served his time, and you know, then they're sort of recognizing why he's in prison. Talking about people who genuinely seem to admire him. And believe me, there are people out there who have this perverse admiration for criminals. It's the same with the Cray twins, you know. And that's the only concern I have with films like Legend with Tom Hardy. Now, I won't deny it was an impressive film. Hardy was great in the role, but I do think there is a risk that films like that can glorify basically criminals. There's nothing to admire about the Cray twins. There's nothing to admire about Bronson either. Um, we're not quite as bad as American culture where criminals really are glorified, but you know, there's too many people out there who seem to think that, they seem to take it really personally that someone like this is denied parole. I personally will not lose any sleep over it. Personally, I'm a lot more concerned about miscarriages of justice. You know, there was a case, the murder of little Leslie Molsey, she was a little girl who was murdered in the north of England back in the 70s, and an innocent man, Stephen Kitchko, went to prison for years for her murder. Turned out he was innocent and he was attacked on the inside. Cases like that are horrendous. Miscarriages of justice are horrendous. But in the case of Brunson, it's not a miscarriage of justice. You know, there was no question on his guilt. So really, I think there's something perverse about people crying over this guy. I appreciate that people might think it's the wrong decision, but for goodness sake, don't act as if there's something to feel sorry for here, like he's some sort of tragic figure. He's not. He's a violent career criminal. And, this refrain, oh, but he didn't kill anyone, it sort of trivializes the things he did do. That's like saying, oh, well, drug dealers don't directly kill anyone. He's an armed robber. That's what he was in prison for. He's held people hostage. And that's, contrary to some of the things that are going around. That wasn't like decades ago. Apparently, the latest incident was in 2014. So, naturally, as he gets older, he's going to be physically weaker. I just don't think that he should be turned into some sort of victim or treated like some sort of folk hero because he's anything but. Um, so that's my take on it. And the people who say there's worse criminals out there now, I agree, there are. I've no doubt that there are child killers and terrorists in our midst who pose a much bigger threat than this guy, but that doesn't mean he's innocent. It doesn't mean he's someone to feel sorry for. And it doesn't mean that the parole board has made the wrong decision. They would have factored in all of this stuff. So I don't always say this, but I think they've got the decision right on this occasion. But I do wish they were more consistent, and at times they absolutely deserve criticism. Um, yeah, and I do think then there's understandable anger at the lack of consistency. But I'm angry at people glorifying Bronson. I have a big problem with that. Let me know your thoughts.